Traveling abroad should broaden your horizons and give you authentic cultural experiences. But some American tourists take "when in Rome" to spectacular extremes that horrify locals and create international incidents. Here are 44 times American tourists tried to experience local culture and prove that good intentions plus cultural ignorance equals legendary disasters. 1. An American woman in Japan spent her entire vacation bowing to absolutely everyone and everything, including vending machines, street signs, and parked bicycles. She'd read that bowing was important in Japanese culture, but missed the part about context and appropriateness. Japanese locals watched in bewilderment as she performed deep, formal bows to inanimate objects while walking down the street, treating traffic lights and shop windows like honored elders deserving respect. 2. A tourist in Italy became convinced that speaking louder and adding "o" to the end of English words would help locals understand him better. He spent 2 weeks ordering hamburger row and Coca-Cola while shouting at waiters who spoke perfect English. Restaurant staff began avoiding his table because his enthusiastic Italianized English was more confusing than just speaking normally, and his volume suggested he thought all Italians were deaf. 3. An American man in Scotland wore a kilt every day of his vacation, despite having no Scottish heritage, and insisted on calling everyone laddie regardless of their age or gender. He'd rented the most tourist-oriented clan tartan available and walked around Edinburgh addressing elderly women as laddie and explaining Scottish history he'd learned from watching Braveheart. Locals began crossing the street to avoid his enthusiastic but completely inaccurate cultural commentary. 4. A woman visiting France decided to live like a local by shopping only at farmers markets and refusing to speak any English for her entire 2-week trip. Her French vocabulary consisted of approximately 15 words from a phrasebook, leading to increasingly desperate hand gestures and pointing when trying to communicate. She spent 40 minutes at a cheese stand trying to mime lactose intolerant and ended up purchasing several pounds of the strongest cheese available because she couldn't explain her dietary restrictions. 5. An American tourist in Germany became obsessed with punctuality after reading that Germans value timeliness, so he began arriving everywhere exactly 15 minutes early and loudly commenting on other people's lateness. He would sit in restaurant lobbies checking his watch and making disapproving noises when his dining companions arrived at their actual reservation time. German friends had to explain that being excessively early was just as rude as being late, and his time-obsessed behavior was making everyone uncomfortable. 6. A couple visiting India decided to embrace the spiritual culture by attempting to meditate in every temple, sacred site, and religious location they encountered, regardless of whether meditation was appropriate or welcome. They would spread yoga mats in the middle of active worship services and close their eyes in lotus position while devotees tried to navigate around them. Temple officials repeatedly had to explain that their spiritual tourism was disrupting actual religious practices and that meditation wasn't always the appropriate response to sacred spaces. 7. An American man in Mexico became convinced that haggling was required for every purchase, including items with fixed prices in department stores and chain restaurants. He spent his vacation negotiating with cashiers at McDonald's, trying to bargain down the price of Big Macs, and arguing with hotel front desk staff about room rates that were clearly posted online. Store managers had to repeatedly explain that bargaining wasn't universal Mexican culture, and that some businesses operated with standard pricing, just like in America. 8. A woman visiting Thailand decided to show respect for local culture by weighing the traditional Thai greeting constantly throughout her trip. But she performed the gesture incorrectly and at inappropriate times. She would why to street vendors, taxi drivers, and even stray dogs, often holding the position for uncomfortably long periods while making intense eye contact. Thai locals found her enthusiastic but inaccurate cultural participation endearing but exhausting, especially when she insisted on whying goodbye to her hotel room each morning. 9. An American tourist in Australia spent his entire vacation trying to use Australian slang he'd learned from movies, calling everyone mate and ending every sentence with no worries, even when the situation was clearly worrying. His forced Australian accent and inappropriate slang usage made conversations bizarre, especially when he kept asking locals if they'd seen any drop bears and whether he needed special equipment to avoid them. Australians began playing along with increasingly ridiculous drop bear stories just to see how gullible his cultural enthusiasm had made him. 10. A couple visiting China became obsessed with using chopsticks for every meal, including foods that were traditionally eaten with forks or spoons. They would spend 30 minutes trying to eat soup with chopsticks while their Chinese hosts offered spoons, and they attempted to cut and consume entire fish using only wooden sticks. Restaurant staff watched in amazement as they struggled through meals that should have taken 15 minutes, all while explaining to nearby diners that they were experiencing authentic Chinese dining culture. 11. An American woman in Brazil decided to connect with local dance culture by attempting to samba everywhere she went, including grocery stores, museums, and business meetings. She would break into improvised samba moves while waiting in lines during conversations, and even while walking down the street. Brazilians found her enthusiasm charming but completely exhausting, especially when she insisted on teaching other tourists her version of samba steps that bore no resemblance to actual Brazilian dance techniques. 12. A tourist in Russia became convinced that drinking vodka was a cultural requirement and insisted on toasting with vodka at every meal, including breakfast meetings and afternoon coffee dates. He would carry a flask of vodka and suggest inappropriate toasts during business lunches and family dinners. Russian colleagues had to explain that vodka wasn't consumed at every social interaction, and that his constant drinking suggestions were making professional meetings awkward and potentially problematic. 13. An American man visiting Ireland spent his vacation searching for leprechauns and asking locals for directions to where the little green men hang out. He genuinely believed leprechauns were real parts of Irish culture that locals would know about, and he became frustrated when Irish people treated his leprechaun hunting as a joke. He spent considerable money on leprechaun detection equipment from tourist shops and was convinced that locals were hiding leprechaun locations from him out of protectiveness. 14. A woman in Spain decided to embrace siesta culture by taking naps everywhere, including park benches, museum floors, and restaurant booths during her afternoon meals. She would arrive at tourist attractions around 2 p.m., spread out a blanket, and begin napping while other visitors tried to enjoy the sights. Spanish locals had to explain that siesta was a personal rest time at home, not a public napping exhibition, and that sleeping in tourist locations was disruptive to other visitors and potentially unsafe. 15. An American tourist in Egypt became obsessed with ancient Egyptian culture and insisted on communicating through hieroglyphic drawings he'd copied from the internet. He would show elaborate pictographs to hotel staff, taxi drivers, and tour guides instead of speaking, convinced that modern Egyptians would appreciate his effort to use traditional Egyptian communication. His hieroglyphic conversations confused everyone and took 3 times longer than normal interactions, especially since his symbols often meant completely different things than he intended. 16. A couple visiting Argentina decided to live the tango lifestyle by attempting to tango everywhere they went, including subway platforms, hotel lobbies, and grocery stores. They would break into dramatic tango poses during normal conversations and insist on tango walking instead of regular walking. Argentinians found their enthusiasm amusing but completely impractical, especially when they blocked pedestrian traffic with spontaneous tango performances and refused to move normally through crowded spaces. 17. An American man in Turkey became convinced that carpet buying was a mandatory cultural experience and spent hours each day in carpet shops, negotiating for rugs he didn't want or need. He would engage in elaborate bargaining sessions for carpets that wouldn't fit in his luggage, convinced that the negotiation process was more important than actually purchasing anything. Turkish carpet dealers became frustrated with his time-consuming negotiations that never resulted in sales, especially when he would return the next day to practice his bargaining skills on the same unwanted carpets. 18. A woman visiting Morocco decided to embrace local fashion by wearing a jalaba, traditional robe, everywhere, but she wore it incorrectly and in inappropriate situations. She would wear the traditional garment to beaches, nightclubs, and formal business meetings, often with the hood up indoors, and combined with Western accessories like sneakers and baseball caps. Moroccan locals appreciated her cultural interest, but were confused by her fashion combinations and inappropriate usage of traditional clothing in modern contexts. 19. An American tourist in Greece became obsessed with ancient Greek philosophy and insisted on engaging locals in deep philosophical discussions about existence, democracy, and the meaning of life during casual interactions. He would corner waiters, taxi drivers, and shopkeepers with lengthy discussions about Aristotle and Plato, assuming that all Greeks were naturally philosophical and interested in lengthy debates about ancient wisdom. Modern Greeks found his assumption that they were all amateur philosophers both amusing and exhausting. 20. A couple visiting Kenya decided to connect with wildlife culture by attempting to communicate with animals in national parks, using what they believed were traditional African animal calls they'd learned from nature documentaries. They would make elaborate whooping and clicking sounds at lions, elephants, and giraffes, convinced that local tribes had taught them these communication techniques. Park rangers had to explain that their animal noises were not traditional communication methods and were potentially dangerous when used around actual wild animals. 21. An American man in Vietnam became convinced that wearing a conical hat, non lei, would help him blend in with locals, but he wore it constantly, including indoors, at formal dinners, and during business meetings. He would refuse to remove the hat even when entering temples or meeting government officials, explaining that he was honoring Vietnamese culture by maintaining traditional dress. Vietnamese hosts had to repeatedly explain hat etiquette and appropriate times for traditional clothing versus modern social situations. 22. A woman visiting Peru decided to experience indigenous culture by attempting to communicate only in Spanish phrases she'd learned that were supposedly based on ancient Incan languages. Her traditional phrases were actually modern Spanish, mixed with made-up sounds she thought sounded authentically ancient. Peruvian locals were confused by her linguistic experiments and had to explain that modern Peru had evolved beyond ancient communication methods and that regular Spanish or English would be more effective for daily interactions. 23. An American tourist in Cuba became obsessed with salsa dancing and insisted on salsaing through every social interaction, including business meetings, medical appointments, and formal dinners. He would attempt to turn handshakes into dance moves and insist on salsa walking instead of normal walking. Cuban colleagues found his enthusiasm charming, but completely impractical for professional interactions, especially when he tried to conduct business meetings while maintaining salsa rhythm and refusing to stand still during serious conversations. 24. A couple visiting Nepal decided to embrace mountain culture by attempting to dress and act like Sherpa guides, despite having no mountain climbing experience or cultural connection to the region. They would wear traditional mountaineering gear to restaurants and museums, speak in what they thought was a Sherpa accent, and offer unsolicited climbing advice to actual mountaineers. Nepalese locals found their costume performance respectful in intention but completely inaccurate in execution, especially when they began explaining mountain survival techniques they'd learned from movies. 25. An American man in South Korea became convinced that bowing was required for every interaction and began performing elaborate bowing rituals for simple transactions like buying coffee or asking for directions. He would hold extended bows while making eye contact and attempt to outbow Korean locals in increasingly formal displays of respect. Korean people appreciated his cultural awareness, but were confused by his excessive bowing duration and inappropriate bowing context that made simple interactions awkwardly ceremonial. 26. A woman visiting Jamaica decided to connect with reggae culture by speaking in what she believed was authentic Jamaican patois, but her accent and vocabulary were based entirely on movies and music she'd heard. Her attempted patois was incomprehensible to actual Jamaicans, and often unintentionally offensive when her mispronunciations changed meanings completely. Locals had to politely explain that her accent work was more confusing than helpful, and that regular English would facilitate better communication than her enthusiastic but inaccurate linguistic attempts. 27. An American tourist in Portugal became obsessed with fado music and insisted on singing fado-style songs during inappropriate moments, including business meetings, casual dinners, and while walking through museums. He would break into mournful, dramatic singing without warning, convinced that he was honoring Portuguese musical tradition. Portuguese locals appreciated his cultural interest, but were startled by his spontaneous performances, and had to explain that fado was specific performance art, not casual background music for daily activities. 28. A couple visiting Indonesia decided to embrace island culture by attempting to live entirely on tropical fruits and coconut water. Convinced that this was how locals traditionally sustained themselves, they would refuse restaurant meals and spend hours searching for coconut vendors, often becoming malnourished and exhausted from their restrictive, authentic diet. Indonesian locals had to explain that modern Indonesian cuisine was diverse and nutritious, and that their fruit-only diet was neither traditional nor healthy for extended periods. 29. An American man in Uruguay became convinced that soccer enthusiasm was mandatory for cultural integration, and began providing loud, enthusiastic commentary during every soccer match he encountered, despite knowing nothing about the sport or teams involved. He would shout American football terminology during soccer games and attempt to start crowd chants using phrases he'd made up. Uruguayan soccer fans found his enthusiasm endearing but completely confusing, especially when his sports commentary revealed his complete lack of soccer knowledge. 30. A woman visiting Ghana decided to connect with African textile culture by attempting to tie and wear traditional fabrics. But she would wear them incorrectly and in inappropriate combinations that confused local fashion customs. She would combine different tribal patterns randomly and wear ceremonial fabrics to casual events, creating fashion combinations that were culturally meaningless or occasionally inappropriate. Ghanaian locals appreciated her interest in traditional textiles, but had to explain appropriate usage and cultural significance of different fabric patterns and ceremonial versus daily wear. 31. An American tourist in Iceland became obsessed with Viking culture and insisted on speaking in what he believed was ancient Norse, despite the fact that modern Icelanders speak contemporary Icelandic. He would attempt to order food and ask for directions using medieval phrases he'd learned from historical websites and fantasy movies. Icelanders found his linguistic enthusiasm amusing but completely impractical, especially when his ancient Norse was actually a mixture of Old English, German, and made-up sounds that bore no resemblance to any actual historical language. 32. A couple visiting Malaysia decided to embrace multicultural diversity by attempting to participate in every cultural tradition they encountered simultaneously, often creating confusing combinations of different ethnic customs within single interactions. They would bow Japanese style to Indian vendors while speaking Chinese phrases and wearing Malay traditional clothing, creating cultural mashups that confused everyone involved. Malaysian locals appreciated their enthusiasm for diversity but had to explain that different cultural practices had specific contexts, and that combining them randomly was more confusing than respectful. 33. An American man in Lebanon became convinced that hookah smoking was required for authentic Middle Eastern cultural experience, and insisted on smoking hookah at every social gathering, including business meetings, family dinners, and formal events. He would bring his own hookah equipment to inappropriate venues, and attempt to share tobacco with people who didn't smoke. Lebanese colleagues had to explain that hookah was social recreation, not mandatory cultural participation, and that many people chose not to smoke for health or personal reasons. 34. A woman visiting Poland decided to honor Eastern European traditions by attempting to speak Russian to everyone, assuming that all Eastern Europeans shared the same language and cultural background. She would greet Polish locals in Russian and become frustrated when they didn't respond enthusiastically to her linguistic efforts. Polish people had to repeatedly explain the difference between Polish and Russian languages, and the distinct cultural identities of different Eastern European countries, correcting her assumption that the region was culturally homogeneous. 35. An American tourist in Colombia became obsessed with coffee culture and insisted on evaluating and commenting on every cup of coffee he encountered, despite having no coffee expertise beyond drinking Starbucks at home. He would engage baristas and cafe owners in lengthy discussions about bean origins, roasting techniques, and brewing methods using terminology he'd learned from coffee websites. Colombian coffee professionals found his enthusiasm charming, but his knowledge superficial, especially when his coffee critiques revealed his inexperience with actual coffee appreciation beyond basic consumer preferences. 36. A couple visiting Finland decided to embrace Nordic minimalism by refusing to use any modern conveniences or technology during their trip, convinced that Finns lived simple, technology-free lifestyles. They would walk everywhere instead of using public transportation, refuse to use credit cards or smartphones, and attempt to navigate using only paper maps from tourist centers. Finnish locals had to explain that Finland was actually one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, and that their rejection of modern conveniences was making their trip unnecessarily difficult and completely inaccurate culturally. 37. An American man in Bangladesh became convinced that eating only with his hands was culturally required and refused to use utensils for any meal, including foods that were traditionally eaten with spoons or forks. He would attempt to eat soup, rice dishes, and elaborate curries using only his fingers, creating messy dining experiences that confused restaurant staff and dining companions. Bangladeshi hosts had to explain that while some foods were traditionally eaten by hand, others required utensils, and that cultural authenticity didn't mean rejecting all modern dining tools. 38. A woman visiting Venezuela decided to connect with Latin American passion by speaking dramatically and emotionally during every conversation, convinced that all Latin Americans communicated with intense emotional expression. She would gesture wildly, speak in exaggerated tones, and respond to casual questions with theatrical enthusiasm that made normal interactions feel like dramatic performances. Venezuelan locals found her intensity overwhelming and had to explain that passionate culture didn't mean every conversation required dramatic flair, and that normal, calm communication was perfectly acceptable and often preferred. 39. An American tourist in Estonia became obsessed with Baltic history and insisted on relating every modern situation to medieval historical events, treating contemporary Estonia as if it were still stuck in the Middle Ages. He would ask locals about Vikings, medieval guilds, and ancient trading routes during casual conversations about modern topics like restaurants, transportation, and entertainment. Estonian people appreciated his historical interest, but were frustrated by his inability to engage with modern Estonian culture and his assumption that the country hadn't evolved beyond its medieval past. 40. A couple visiting Cambodia decided to embrace Buddhist philosophy by attempting to meditate everywhere and offering unsolicited spiritual advice to locals based on Western interpretations of Eastern philosophy they'd learned from self-help books. They would sit in lotus position in busy markets, offer meditation guidance to Buddhist monks, and explain karma and enlightenment concepts to people who had grown up with these traditions. Cambodian Buddhists found their spiritual enthusiasm well-intentioned, but culturally presumptuous, especially when they attempted to teach traditional concepts to people who had deeper cultural understanding than their tourist-level knowledge. 41. An American man in Ukraine became convinced that vodka toasting was required for every social interaction, and insisted on carrying a bottle of vodka to share during inappropriate occasions like business meetings, museum visits, and casual coffee dates. He would suggest vodka toast during afternoon sightseeing tours and attempt to turn professional interactions into drinking sessions. Ukrainian colleagues had to explain that vodka culture had specific social contexts, and that constant drinking suggestions were making normal social and business interactions awkward and potentially problematic for professional relationships. 42. A woman visiting Croatia decided to embrace Mediterranean lifestyle by attempting to take afternoon naps everywhere, including beaches during peak hours, restaurant patios during lunch service, and public benches in busy tourist areas. She would spread out towels and pillows in inappropriate locations and become frustrated when locals didn't accommodate her napping schedule or respect her designated sleep areas. Croatian locals had to explain that Mediterranean relaxation culture didn't mean sleeping in public spaces during business hours, and that her napping locations were disruptive to normal community activities and tourism. 43. An American tourist in Bulgaria became obsessed with traditional folk dancing and insisted on performing Bulgarian folk dance moves during every social gathering. Despite having learned the steps from YouTube videos and having no understanding of their cultural significance or appropriate context, he would break into elaborate folk dances during restaurant dinners, business meetings, and casual street conversations, often performing moves incorrectly and at inappropriate times. Bulgarian locals appreciated his cultural interest, but were confused by his assumption that folk dancing was casual social behavior, rather than specific cultural performance art with traditional contexts and meanings. 44. And finally, the most spectacularly misguided cultural experience of all time. A couple visiting multiple European countries decided to experience authentic European culture by creating their own cultural immersion challenge, where they would adopt a different European stereotype in each country based on American movie depictions of European cultures. In France, they wore berets and carried baguettes everywhere while speaking in exaggerated French accents. In Germany, they wore lederhosen to business meetings and insisted on drinking beer for breakfast. In Italy, they spoke only in pasta-related metaphors and gestured dramatically during every conversation. In England, they carried umbrellas during sunny weather and attempted to speak in various British accents they'd learned from different movies, often switching between Cockney, Scottish, and posh British within single sentences. Their European tour became a traveling cultural disaster as they moved from country to country, performing increasingly ridiculous stereotypes based on decades-old Hollywood depictions. Locals in each country had to explain that their cultural performances were based on outdated caricatures rather than actual contemporary European life, and that their enthusiastic stereotype adoption was more entertaining than authentic. Their cultural immersion challenge became legendary among European tourism workers who shared stories about the American couple who thought Europeans still lived like characters from 1950s movies. These cultural experiences prove that enthusiasm without understanding can turn meaningful cultural exchange into unintentional comedy shows that entertain locals for all the wrong reasons. Which story made you cringe the hardest? The hieroglyphic communication attempt? The European stereotype tour? The constant inappropriate bowing? Tell us about the most culturally confused tourist you've ever encountered. And subscribe for more proof that good intentions plus cultural ignorance equals legendary travel disasters.